this slide. I think we all know why we care so much about the prevalence of delusions. And, there's not a really hard and fast difference between delusions held by mentally ill people and delusions held by people who we hold to be sane only because a lot of other people share their same delusion. Now, I'm going to start off with a bit of a disclaimer. So first of all, we don't really know what's going on in the brains of people who are deluded. Most of the evidence that I'm going to present to you is based on a few studies with small samples. As you probably know, studies based on small samples are, suspect. They are liable to the kind of reading in artifacts that we are so familiar with. On the other hand, we do have some evidence, and most of these small studies point in a few fairly consistent directions, and I will emphasize those tonight. And I think they do shed some light. But let me just, point to that picture on the right there. This is now a staple of popular magazine articles. We all love to see these pictures of the brain lighting up. These are constructs. There's no light in a normal brain. Unless you're a genetically engineered animal, running a task under my microscope or someone else's microscope, your brain doesn't light up. This is a synthetic image based on some statistical processing, and nobody's brain actually looks like that. One of the things you learn if you spend some time doing fMRI analysis is that everybody's different. So be skeptical. Okay, now with those preambles, I'm going to start by talking about dogmatic personality. I've already given you some unwelcome perspectives. And then let's talk, then we'll have a bit of a break to discuss. Then I want to talk about personal delusions, including the kind of delusions that you and I experience on a regular basis. And you're thinking, what? Me deluded? I'm rational. Well, I want to introduce you to some delusions that you'll probably say, oh yes, that's me. And then I want to talk about social dogmas and delusions, and then put this all into perspective and think about what can we do? What is a way forward? So that's the plan. So let's start off with dogmatism. So what is a dogmatic personality? And I had to crib this cartoon from the New Yorker a few weeks ago that just sums it up. No matter what the evidence, in your opinions, whether they're political opinions or religious opinions, you have an absolutely invariant, absolutely pugnacious view about being right. So you might think to yourself, well, just a second, yeah, that's somebody else. We know dogmatic people, but that's none of my friends are like that. So how would you tell if you're dogmatic or if your friends are dogmatic? Well, one of the, there's a number of indicators, particularly in language. So bold and sweeping language, especially with heavy use of abstractions like necessity or freedom, is typically associated with dogmatic and inflexible thinking. And that can happen, again, on both sides of the liberal conservative divide here in America. And you probably know some people like this. I came across a study a few months ago by some researchers at Microsoft that did a machine learning approach. And I'm just including this because I think this is probably the way we're going to do this in the future. So they quantified. If you looked at someone's use of language, could you tell if they're dogmatic? So what they did is they had people, intelligent people looking at people's posts on social media and then deciding, making a judgment. about whether they're dogmatic, and then they used a statistical model. What kinds of words tended to occur in those posts that were considered dogmatic versus those posts that were considered less dogmatic. And so, you know, some of these are not so surprising. So people who are dogmatic tend not to say I think or I believe or I feel. They use a lot more definitive words, even words like are, which occurs 50% more in dogmatic posts than non-dogmatic posts, and a lot of pejoratives. Not surprisingly, that's 2.5 times as common in dogmatic posts. So someone's treacherous or someone's illogical, depending on your political persuasion. So here are some surprises. There's a lot more use of you and they, again, about 50% more in dogmatic posts. And that's because they're mostly talking about other, you know, objectifying other people. And here's some here's some unsuspecting ones. There's about only half as many past tense descriptions of actual events. There may be a lot of past tense sort of abstraction. You know, Rome fell because of, or our, you know, forebears, you know, wanted to defend against this. But there's relatively few descriptions of concrete events that actually happened in the past. And again, so we're not quite sure why that is, but these are sort of indicators. So again, if you, I recommend this paper if you're ever in doubt about, about somebody you're interacting with. Now, of course, you know, we are more familiar with religious belief as a kind of dogmatic thing. And so let's start looking at some of these brain-related measures. So this is really the first study that I know of that tried to compare what you might call belief or dogmatic belief with you know, generally accepted facts. You know, what's different in the brain when a person is thinking about something that they believe that's not really verifiable, as opposed to something that's just a fact, like, you know, the capital of North Dakota is Fargo, or the capital of Michigan is Lansing, or the, you know, the capital of Massachusetts is Boston. I hope that's right. I used to live there, so I should be. So and this was actually done by Sam Harris. So Sam Harris, for reasons of his own, went and did a PhD in neuroscience at Stanford. And of course, if you're a famous speaker and have high speaking fees, you can afford to do these things. And I would have loved to have him as a student because he was very obviously motivated. So he got his PhD from Stanford, and part of the work was, although not the work that he got, that was the keystone of his thesis, was this work on reading sort of religious beliefs and dogmas versus commonly agreed statements to believers and to atheists. And there are a couple of findings in this study. Again, a small sample, about 30 people. So first of all is that if you're going to disbelieve something, that takes more work generally than believing something. It takes more effort overall. So there's more regions of the brain activated in disbelief than in belief. I'm not showing a picture of that, but just generally that's true. But in particular, one area of the brain seems to be less active when you're disbelieving something, and more active when you're believing something. As you know, believing something that's you might call a dogma or a shared belief. And that is this area called which, you know, we have this mouthful, ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And that's this area here. So let me explain these images because we're going to have a few of these. These are MR magnetic resonance cross sections. So no person was harmed in making these pictures, I can assure you. So this is a view as if you were slicing the brain down the midline and you are looking on the inside. So if you were to slice the dead person's brain down the midline, like this, and then you were to look, you take out the left side of the brain and then look at the inside. So that's a view we rarely see. You would see this kind of view. And this is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. So here's the top. Here's your brainstem going down to your spinal cord. And this area is a part of the medial cortex. It's part of the prefrontal cortex. So it's toward the front. It's in the medial areas. So this would be sort of right behind the middle of your forehead. And these colors are an indication of basically how much above typical, how much above normal these brain regions are differing when you're asking to believe, when you're asking someone to think about something they believe as opposed to something that's a generally accepted fact. And this cross-section is looking as if you slice the brain sort of at about the level of the ears horizontally. So again, this is the front and this is the back, and the top, the front is at the top. It looks inverted, doesn't it? Because you're actually imagining looking at it from the bottom. That's called the neurological convention, and it's an endless source of confusion to me, but and to most people who are not neurologists, but it's just the way these things are typically displayed. So you can see that the area that's most distinctive is this ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and I want you to keep that in mind, even if you can't say that, but we'll come back to that. So one more study. So this was a similar study by two people not connected with the humanist movement particularly, but looking at brain activity in response to testable versus non-testable statements. That's a little more complex, but they typically find similar kinds of things with some more activation in these areas here, which are also areas which we would consider that are related to sort of personal identity. So I should actually give you, let's go back to this. I forgot to give you a sort of an interpretation. This area is very much related to close personal relationships. So if you, let's say you've lost a parent, this area will be very active. If you have done something that really gets your spouse upset and you're feeling guilty about it, as you should, this area will be very active. So it's something that has to do with monitoring, and especially threats to close personal relationships. These areas seem to be active more in situations where you're identifying as part of a group. I'm an American, or I'm a man, or whatever particular identity group you belong to, or I'm a resident of Michigan. Okay, and then I'd like to, instead of talking about sort of activation of specific regions, I'd like to look at a study, fairly recent study, regarding overconfidence. And the brain measures here are not activity, but communication, really correlation, which we take as a proxy for communication, meaning that is this brain area active at the same time as another brain area? And if one of them is quiet, is the other one also quiet? So we're looking at correlations, which are often regarded as a kind of proxy for communication, that these areas are talking to each other. And one of the striking findings, in fact, the main finding of this paper was that, or the study, was that people who are overconfident as they're making judgments, and that's not quite the same as that's not the same as having a dogmatic personality, but it's certainly associated with the trait of dogmatism. that overconfidence is associated with a higher correlation, or what they call greater connectivity, between these medial frontal areas, so the areas I just pointed to, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and other medial areas, and the rest of the brain. So basically, it's talking to the rest of the brain and influencing it. And those of you who've listened into my brain evolution class or talk at AHA a few months ago will remember that ventromedial area has very thick wiring broadcasting to the whole rest of the human brain. And that's a unique feature of human brains. So let's pause to do a little bit of interpretation. And I'm just summing up mostly what I've told you already, that most of these studies sort of converge on these two areas being active in relationship to dogmatic beliefs or religious beliefs. These are the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and these identity regions, which you might think of as partly self-other differentiation, partly I am this kind of a person as opposed to other kinds of persons. That's we call that technically the temporoparietal junction. Just means that it's at the it's where the temporal lobe meets the parietal lobe. And both of these areas are also very active when you pose moral dilemmas to people or ask them to make moral judgments. And so a tentative conclusion that we draw is that these kinds of dogmatic beliefs, as well as a lot of moral decisions, seem to be rooted primarily in maintaining important social relationships rather than sort of rational evaluation. They're not using any of the lateral prefrontal areas or parietal areas involved in solving a math problem or reasoning through a scientific treatise. Those aren't used when you affirm belief. So you might ask, well, okay, so if those areas are active when someone's believing, what happens when you challenge someone's belief? That's what we find ourselves doing a lot these days. So what happens when you challenge a belief? And here's another sort of complex figure. So here are two views of the brain from the usual perspective. This is the left side and the right side. And here from the medial perspective. And then here we're looking from the front. And again, we're seeing areas that are active when a person is sort of resisting an argument, and they are not entirely the same as the areas I've talked about before. But you notice that, again, we have this medial frontal area and this temporal parietal area are active when people are resisting evidence. So Sam Harris, this is a second study, gave them contradictory evidence. What are they going to do with that? So if they're resisting, why are they resisting? Are they reasoning about it? Well, it seems not. They are actually reaffirming, to some extent, their social relationships and their identity. Okay, let me pause there for comments or questions. I'll just stop sharing my screen. What happened here? I'm trying to stop sharing my screen, but I'm not succeeding. So let me try that again. Okay. All right. Any comments or questions or right now?
Yeah, I just, what about compromised use of the frontal lobe due to sort of early childhood trauma, et cetera, that, has sort of the survival mood instinct, but they both can't work sort of simultaneously? Have you come across that in your work?
So I don't work with abused children myself. I've read some of what people who do work with abused children have to say about this. So let me go back to the first part of your question, which was compromised prefrontal lobes. So there's several ways in which you can talk about compromise. You can have brain damage to the prefrontal lobes. Mm-hmm. And there is some evidence, a couple of studies, to show that people who've had that kind of prefrontal damage are, in fact, much more rigid in their thinking and much more dogmatic. Now, you're asking a more subtle question or about, what's happening to abused children. And I don't know of a study on the relationship between adverse childhood experiences or child abuse and later dogmatism. So I can't say if there's any evidence. There might be, but I don't know it. Okay, but it wouldn't surprise me. Mm-hmm. Any other comments or questions? Yes, Michael.
I'm curious, when is the...
Oh, so Marina, then Michael, how about? Or actually, Pamela, I'm going to ask, could you moderate? Because I will get too confused.
Sure, go ahead, Michael.
Did I get this straight that there's an association between these regions associated with dogma and the regions associated with relationships? And,
yes.
Okay, so then that's interesting. I mean, it suggests then that that the dogmatism is sort of inherited from our relationships. Is not the case? I mean,
I don't know if I would use the word inherited, but that it's coming from our need to maintain relationships.
Yeah, in some sense embedded in our relationships, or that we. It's part of the tribalism or part of our relationship with our friends or our loved ones and all this, and that's one of the reasons why it's a hard nut to crack, is because it's so deep into the person's relationship life. Is that not the case?
I would say, that sounds pretty accurate to me.
Okay, thank you.
Marina, you had a question?
So I was just wondering, where is that line about between the strong conviction and dogmatic thinking?
Sorry, where is that line?
Between a strong conviction and dogmatic thinking.
Oh, we like to think we have, or it's almost a compliment to tell people they have strong convictions sometimes. I'm not sure there is, Marina. I kind of think of many of our virtues, or many of the things that we hold up as virtues as really double-edged. So I think you're asking the right question. It's not so easy to draw the line. It's almost in some people like a tragic flaw. It's something that, strong convictions enable them to persevere in the face of opposition, but it can also make them absolutely deaf to wise counsel. We had a situation like this here just recently. The president of our university, a woman who, rose up through the ranks, a very smart woman, but, a very stodgy Midwestern place, in the 80s and 90s. And she made a name for herself and became the president of the university. But she became she was so rigid when she was the president and so unwilling to listen to bad news that when the scandal here erupted, she absolutely refused to take it seriously. And she was pushed out, and it was a real Greek tragedy. And I think the Greek playwrights really understood how human characteristics can both lead to strength and also be the fatal flaws that undermine us in the end.
There's a question in the chat from Mary Mangan. Mm-hmm. And she says, we don't know from this whether this is cause or effect though, right? Dogma causes this concentration of firing, or it gets concentrated in this area as a result of dogma.
We're not really asking cause and effect questions at this point. It's just a neural correlate. It's just saying this is what's happening in a person's brain typically when they're affirming a dogmatic belief. So if you believe, like I do, that basically the brain is what causes your behavior, then I'm inclined to think that this is coming from, whatever brain activity you have, and it suggests that part of what's going on when you're dogmatic is that you're engaging circuitry related to social relationships.
We have a question from someone who would like to know if copies of the slides would be available to people anywhere.
I think there's a recording. Let me think about that. If I have some requests, I might be able to make some of the slides available. Yeah.
And Ro comments, I wonder why some people are breaking with their families because they'd rather believe in the dogma from outside sources.
That's a good question. And I think a lot of people who study cults and political movements and would like to know the answer to that. I mean, there's certainly been lots of speculation. I think you probably have run across this, that, maybe their relationships with their families are very conflicted. They're looking for a surrogate family. And these are speculations, of course. I'm just throwing out the kinds of ideas that psychologists have come up with. But I'm inclined to think that there's not a single explanation. It's like if you talk to 100 people in a cult, you find out that, or in a religion, or in a political party, you find out that they're all there for a variety of different reasons. So I suspect.
May I ask for clarification?
Sorry?
May I ask for clarification?
Sure, go ahead.
So are you saying every single ex-Mormon who became an atheist and broke up with their family was looking for a surrogate family?
Well, at least the question that I got was why some people are breaking with their families in order to believe in a dogma from outside sources, not why people are leaving a dogma or why people are leaving a cult.
But atheism is just as much of a dogma as anything else, right?
Well, that's a long discussion we could have perhaps over a beer. Let's say that there certainly are some dogmatic atheists. But I wouldn't say that, that would be a longer conversation. I'm going to suggest, because it's 7:40 and I'm a third of the way through, that maybe.
Just one more question from me.
Okay.
I noticed that there's a lot of evidence that once humans make up their mind about anything, dogma or anything, it's very difficult to change their mind with logic.
Can I come back to that, Pamela? I think right at the end?
Sure.
Okay, hold on. Okay, let me go back to sharing screen, and let's go on to the second part about sort of personal delusions. And let's see, is that working? Okay. All right, so let's start again with the definition. What's a delusion? And this is not quite the same as a dogma, but it's certainly related. So it's a belief or impression that you're maintaining, although you're you're contradicted every day by reality. And at least clinically, most delusions have to do, most of the sort of recognized sort of psychiatric delusions have to do with one of the following, usually not more than one. And the one that we're most familiar with, of course, is paranoia, which is feeling or thinking that other people are spying on you or seeking to harm you. But you occasionally read in the news about erotomania, that it seems that every celebrity has 2 or 3 stalkers who believe that this celebrity is actually in love with them and just can't admit it publicly. But if only they can get to the celebrity, the profession of love will come forth. So that's a delusion that's a bit dangerous for the celebrity, as well as being very, very life constricting for the person who holds that delusion. And then you probably know some people who are narcissists. You probably see quite, at least one and probably several on TV fairly often. That somehow the person believes they possess some great unrecognized talent or hidden knowledge. Now, I'd say that the general thinking among psychiatrists, this is not a consensus, it's not an established fact, but I think the general, more common thinking is that people who have these kinds of delusions have a strong feeling of suspicion or of self-regard or love, and they are then trying to make sense of their feelings in terms of their everyday experience. And they form, a rationalization which becomes a delusion as they try to make sense. This is perhaps most easily seen with paranoid people, that they have this feeling that the things are happening that mean something. They're connected somehow, and they're suspicious of them. And then they gradually start forming a story, weaving a story. Okay, the reason that my camera on my computers has been acting up is because actually the CIA is spying on me, or somebody's spying on me, and then I have some reason to believe that it's the CIA. So you gradually put together a story, out of your experiences, but it's based, it's really trying to make sense of the strong feelings you have, and where they come from. You may not really know. So, so these are the kinds of clinical delusions that we read about in the news, or we can attribute to somebody else, but at least we think we don't have any of these delusions, right? So I'd like to introduce you to a kind of delusion that every one of us have fairly often. And that's the false memory delusion. And this is something that, you say, no, it can't be true. And yet it's been demonstrated in large studies dozens of times in many different countries with many different groups of people. And I'll just give you an example. This is one of the sort of flagship studies in this genre. So if I were to ask you about the Challenger explosion in the where were you when you heard that the Challenger had exploded, or had failed to, or the boosters had exploded? So just think back, and most of you probably have a very distinctive memory of this. I know exactly, I can tell you the story. So a psychologist at Cornell University, who was studying memory, thought, the day after this had happened, thought this would be an ideal test case to study. So in his first year psychology class, he asked everybody to write down where they were, what they were doing, and who they were with when they heard that the Challenger had exploded. Okay. And then he collected all those pieces of paper. And he kept them. He kept them for 2.5 years. And then when these students were in their final year, he tried to locate all the students. Most of them were still around. And he asked them the same 3 questions. And of course, he had them put their names on it so he could match them up. And he then compared the answers. And what's remarkable is that roughly half of the people gave completely, utterly different answers 2.5 years later than they did right at the day after the event. And only about 40% got, yeah, more or less right. Very few people got all the details, you know, consonant between the times. And I see some scrunch, you know, some puzzled faces like, how is this possible? I mean, I know what happened to me, right? Well, this is one of the great sort of paradoxes of memory. And now it's this, as I said, this has been replicated now. I mean, this is a startling finding. We don't want to believe it. So it's something that damn well should be replicated before we believe it. But it's now been replicated dozens of times. It was, of course, right after 9/11. There were, you know, psychology classes all over the country were doing this experiment. It's the same thing every time. It's been done in many different countries. So this is a remarkable finding because, you know, we have such vivid memories. And so I pinched a Scott Adams cartoon, a Dilbert cartoon, to illustrate that, that maybe vivid memories aren't the same as reliable memories. And if you're interested in this, I recommend this book by Daniel Schacter. It's a bit dated now, but it's still, I think, the best comprehensive summary. But so just a few years ago, someone had the smart idea of actually trying to tease apart what brain activity makes a memory vivid, as opposed to what brain activity makes a memory accurate. And it turns out that you can actually find distinct, and, you know, again, take this with several grains of salt, maybe a teaspoon of salt. But it seems that the areas of the brain that are most associated with accuracy, whose activity, so this is, you know, if you're recalling something, you're in the scanner, and so you can sort of measure at least which broad regions of the brain are active when you're doing something. And then, of course, they keep track of, you know, did you get it right? And they ask you to rate, okay, how vivid is it for you? And then they ask you for details. And then can you know, how precise is your memory? And these are all separable. So you can have a detailed memory that's very vivid, and it can be completely inaccurate. Or you can have a correct memory that is imprecise or may not be vivid, or that's precise and not vivid, or that's vivid and not precise and just very vague. And these all seem to depend. And of course, whenever you are recalling a memory, you're getting several, you know, many of these brain regions are active, but it seems that, you know, the more active the hippocampus is, the more likely it is that you're remembering, you know, you're accurate. The more accurate this area here, the subgenual area here, sorry, not subgenual, this is the, I always get this area, the back of the brain mixed up. It'll come to me in a minute. And then vividness is related to another area sort of at the back of the brain, and I'm trying to remember what that's called. All right, I apologize. Oh yeah, here we have it here. Then below, the left angular gyrus is involved in more precision. So that's at the sort of at the angle near the temporoparietal junction, and then vividness is related to this area here, the precuneus. That's the thing I was trying to remember. See, it happens to me. Well, I'm over 60, so I have an excuse. And I've just put in a grant today, so that's another excuse. So that may have a lot more to do with, you know, how much emotion you brings back with to you. So it seems that, you know, these different aspects of memory are at least somewhat separable, both in terms of phenomenology, in terms of what people report, and also in terms of brain activity. And again, this, you know, this needs to be replicated, but it's suggestive. So maybe vividness is not quite the warrant of truth that we commonly take it to be. And this has now that, and this false memory research over the last 20 years has really started to make an impact on the justice system. And it turns out that, as you know, a great many people who have been convicted by eyewitness testimony turn out to be exonerated by DNA evidence. So what do you do with that? So you're thinking, okay, well, this can't happen to me, and maybe it doesn't happen to you, but it does happen to a lot of people. So a woman at Warwick University did a sort of reanalysis of 8 false memory implantation studies, and these are not serious attempts to manipulate you. They just bring you into the lab and they talk to you nicely for 20 minutes, and they just ask you questions about something that happened to you that didn't actually happen to you. And it turns out that roughly half of people will at least concede that this event, this false event, happened to them. And half of that half, so a quarter of all the people they bring into the lab, after just 20 minutes of sweet talking, will further they'll make up stories on their own. They will vividly imagine this false event on their own and provide further details beyond what the experimenter is asking for. And you think, holy crap, are people really that malleable, really that gullible? Well, maybe not everybody, and maybe on this call, probably we have a lot of hard-headed skeptics. We're overrepresented, hard-headed skeptics here, but an awful lot, that's half the electorate, and they didn't try very hard. I mean, you can't really invest a lot of effort in a psychology study with 200 or 300 people. On the other hand, political parties and religions really go to a great deal of effort to implant ways of thinking. But it's not just manipulation. So of course the people in the Cornell study and the other false memory studies about events, they haven't been manipulated. They did it to themselves. So how did they come to distort their memory? So there's been a lot of research in the last 10 years about how this happens, quite aside from induction, from people manipulating your memories. How do people distort their own memories? And it seems that there's 2 sort of common ways, and there's probably more, but these are some common themes in a lot of the research, is that if you're telling the story about what happened and you get a lot of positive reaction, if people really like to hear about this, and you will bend the tale. You'll tell the tale in ways that get more of a reaction, because we're social creatures. We like attention. And we will unconsciously distort the story in order to get more attention. And, again, some people will do this more than others. If you are hearing about someone else's story, you'll also be more inclined to incorporate elements of that into your own story. And again, this is something that can be observed, and it's, as far as we can tell, mostly unconscious. Interestingly, there was a study just a couple of years ago where they tried to induce a false memory again, and they asked people then to come back to the lab. So they imaged them while they were telling them these false stories. Then they came back to the lab and asked them to, and they told them that that you had a false memory, or you were given a false story. And a significant fraction of people, most people, said, okay, I perhaps I was deceived. Some people didn't believe it to begin with, and some people believed it and then were agreed that they had been deceived. But then there were some people who didn't, said, no, this really happened to me. I have a distinct memory of this. And what's interesting is that they could go back to the scans then that they made of these people while they were being fed the false story. And they said, Okay, what brain areas are active? And guess what? It's your favorite areas, or my favorite areas, these social brain areas. If in those people whose social brain areas were most active, they are the people who ended up insisting that the false memory was actually their own. So maybe we can just take 2 questions, and then maybe I can go on to the last part of the talk. Any questions here? Okay.
There's questions about how we do experiments about dogmatics without, if it's hard to define dogmatics, how do we study?
So I don't know of a study looking at trying to influence people about, let's say, a religious belief or a political belief. Let me see, maybe I do know some studies like that, at least not within a scan, not in a scanner. So I don't know about that. These studies are more about false memories rather than beliefs about God or the universe or the Republican Party. So I don't know what would happen, but I guess that if, I can make some guesses, but I don't know what that's worth. Any other quick question?
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Why, if most people can be persuaded of untrue story to the point where they see that it happened to them, to appease the society or since we're social animals, as you say, why is brainwashing yourself is the most powerful?
Sorry, why is what?
Brainwashing yourself.
I don't know a lot of, well, so first of all, the studies are only finding about 1/4 of people are really insisting on the false memory. So it's not everybody. And I don't know a lot about brainwashing. I think there's sort of several different meanings of that phrase. So maybe I'll punt on that. I don't think I have a good answer to that. Okay, let's.
There's a really interesting TED Talk by Elizabeth Loftus.
Yes.
On memory, on implanted memory.
Yeah, she's one of the leading researchers in this.
I'll put a link in the chat and people can go there if they want.
Yeah. Oh, and Ro was asking, can age be related to vividness of a false memory? Well, that's a very interesting idea. I don't know, but that would be a very good study to do. There's a dogmatic person. I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know the answer. What's the relationship? But let's go on to.
What about drugs related to a vivid memory?
Andy, I'm sure someone's done a study like that. Would you send me a note and I'll see if I can find that. That sounds like something somebody ought to have done.
Have people done studies on false memories in which they put the people actually through the experience while videotaping it, and then afterwards implant false memories about what actually occurred such that they could then go back and demonstrate?
Yes, that has been done. Yeah, that's a very interesting. I'm trying to recall. I don't recall the name or any of the specifics, but I do recall reading a study like that.
It's related to PTSD in veterans.
Okay.
I believe was one study that I saw.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Retraining the brain and the memories associated with the PTSD. That
actually, it's turning out that certain kinds of psychoactive drugs can be very effective in treating PTSD when you know, induce the memory. But let's save that for another time. Okay, let's move on here. So I want to talk about sort of dogma, delusions, and society. And I'd like to sort of come back to the you know, the issue of these prefrontal, medial prefrontal regions that seem to be activated, particularly with regard to close relationships. And one of the most surprising sort of psychometric findings, meaning that, or sorry, that's not quite the right word, but quantitative findings of relating brain traits to psychological traits, was published about 8 years ago. And he's not gotten funding to replicate this, but he's very interested in doing this, in doing more on this. I met him a couple of years ago. And the idea is that the relative volume of this ventromedial area is in fact pretty strongly correlated with how much you value group loyalty. So if you're someone who thinks that betraying your friends is the worst kind of sin, you're very likely to have a very large ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's also fairly correlated with other kinds of conservative values, like you know, how much you take authority seriously. So it's not clear that this is, you know, unique to this trait, but it's an interesting correlation because, you know, not surprisingly, a lot of conservative values seem to, at least to many of us, to involve more belief, at least historically, more dogma. But then if you want to disturb yourself a little bit, listen to my talk on brain evolution, you find that this is one of the areas that's expanded a lot between apes and human beings. So that it's something that we've evolved to have. And again, I think most of these things are sort of double-edged swords. So what does that mean sort of in terms of politics? Well, let's think about flexible thinking and political commitment. We would like, you know, many of us are, I think, sort of inclined, or not, perhaps not all of us, but I think many people on this call are probably inclined toward various leftish or progressive causes. And so we'd like to believe that, you know, we're more open-minded. But it seems, in fact, that people on both extreme ends of the political spectrum are less flexible in their thinking. And again, if you look at the variation, it's huge. You know, the effect sizes are relatively small compared to the variation among individuals, you know, at the extremes or in the middle. But there do seem to be more people with who do well on you know, a test of flexibility in thinking in sort of the, you know, among the independents or generally among moderates than people who are on the extremes of either political party. So this is not, you know, what I would like to see, but this is what the data say. And you know, there's a number of different tests of flexibility, and they all came to more or less the same conclusion with this. So it's perhaps, you know, it's not a straightforward thing. You know, beliefs, political beliefs don't seem to be sort of correlated in a univariate way with open-mindedness. Now, of course, the thing we're really worried about is conspiracy theories. I guess some of you have been reading the articles on QAnon and thinking, holy crap, this is like what happened, you know, this is like the protocols of the elders of Zion and stuff like that. It's really bizarre kind of stuff. So how could, people, especially, the former US National Security Advisor, coming out publicly, supporting this kind of crap. And so I think that we're still working, scientists are still trying to understand, but this has just sort of come to the attention of social science as a major problem in the last couple of years. And there's now a lot of interest, and I hope, with a good outcome to the election, I hope that NSF will be quite bold about funding this kind, research into this kind of very scary crap. What is driving it? And I think most of you have read the same kinds of things I've read, that, partly it's that you can find other people who believe the same kind of crazy shit you believe more easily now than you ever could before. And you can spend all day talking to them if you want. It's sort of interesting. Are several sort of social media groups entirely devoted, comprised of people who believe that the CIA is spying on them. And really paranoid people. But you can, now instead of being privately paranoid, they have group support, and they're sharing messages about how to disable, all of the antennae in your walls. I mean, this is serious. It's what you can find. And I think part of it is also that, for better or for worse, I mean, I'm very much an independent iconoclastic thinker, but, when everybody's an independent iconoclastic thinker, we lose a sort of shared consensus on what the facts are. And that makes people more vulnerable to crazy shit that sort of articulates their paranoid feelings. So let's think about how to make a difference, and just wrap up in the next few minutes. So we want, to get through to people, but I think we need to step back a bit and ask, what are brains for? And, most of us come from a kind of philosophical tradition, even though we all embrace evolution, most of us sort of come from a way of thinking about the world that's really more rooted in Greek philosophy and, Plato and Aristotle, like this fellow Aristotle here, than in a Darwinian or evolutionary kind of thinking. We like to believe that people are reasonable. We think that people intrinsically are reasonable if they're just not manipulated or influenced. And we are continually puzzled by how easily people can be manipulated or can, go off the deep end in their own way. And I think what we humanists, especially, heritors of the Enlightenment, as many of us are, what we don't like to believe is that, we like to emphasize individual thinking, coming to truth on your own. But what we really don't want to think about is how compulsive we are at copying other people. And of course, if you have children, you know this. And we just sort of, but as adults, we are still very much influenced by other people. And Joe Henrich wrote a book 5 years ago arguing that that's really the secret of our success. That, on most sort of cognitive tests that you can give chimps that don't require language, chimps do as well or better than we do. They're not stupid. But they just don't pick up on social cues very readily. They don't want to be like each other. They want to get an edge on each other. And human beings are much more influenced by other people's mannerisms. So he argues that that's really the secret of our success. It's a book that I really recommend. So let's come back to what is reason or rationality. And I think many of us have thought that reason is a property of our brain. Well, we just can't find any spot in the brain that's uniquely devoted to reasoning. In fact, the word rationality comes from the word ratio, which is Latin for an argument, a comparison of two things. And in order to have reason, you need to create spaces to compare the weights of different arguments. It means that, both sides have to be heard. And you have to, be willing to listen to people with whom you disagree. This is the, the famous painting, Freedom of Speech. And, of course, it's depicting something that, is part of your cultural heritage more than mine. But you notice that this guy is talking and nobody likes what he's saying. Everyone else is frowning. They have a sour look on their face because they don't want to listen, but they are listening because that's what reason is about. And I think that that's something that both sides of the political spectrum are losing sight of today. So, how do you get people to listen to reason? Well, I think you go back to, how do people really form opinions? They form opinions based on their relationships. And so the way to really reach somebody is you have to have a real relationship. You're not going to, and this is sort of my answer to Pamela's question, you don't win people's hearts and minds by, meeting someone on the street and browbeating them, showing them that they're absolutely wrong, because they won't listen. I think most of us have had that experience. Many of us have had it several times, but you don't need to have it all the time. And I think if you understand why people change their mind, it's not because of argument generally. A few people do, but that's not the norm. And if you really want to have a dialogue, you have to build up real relationships. People aren't willing to trust their intellectual vulnerability to someone that they don't trust in other ways and that they've just met. So, you should be prepared to explore how you come to your conclusions. And this is something that, the people who practice what they call street epistemology emphasize is, you should lay out how you come to your conclusion, and you should ask how they come to your conclusion. And you should be prepared for the possibility that you're wrong, or that you may have to change your mind. You have to put a little bit on the table to be prepared to lose a little bit yourself, risk a little bit yourself. Okay, and that's, I think, all I'm going to say. So we'll turn it over to back to Pamela and to all of you. Thanks for your attention. Pamela, you're muted.
Thank you, Mark. There are people who have questions in there. If you'd like to speak up, unmute yourselves and jump right in.
Okay. So I noticed someone was saying that the US two-party system doesn't really exhaust the political universe, and I fully agree that we, if you go to Europe, what liberal and conservative labels mean is sort of 90 degrees out of whack with what they mean here in America. That the conservatives there support social programs like, retirement pensions and healthcare and things like that. So it's a very, I agree the two-party system is not the universe. What about the research that shows that people can be convinced by argument, but only a member of their own tribe? I'm not sure I know that research very well. If you've got a good article, I put it in the chat. I'd certainly be interested to follow that up. I find that credible, but I don't know quantitatively how well that works and under what conditions.
I see a question from John Scott.
Okay, okay, please go ahead, John. You should, yeah, go ahead.
I'm not aware that I asked a question. Was that in the chat or did I raise my hand?
I'm sorry, you probably were stretching. I thought you had your hand up. Excuse me.
Oh, thanks for noticing, but no, I don't have a question. Thank you.
I have a comment I'd like to make. Regarding conspiracy theories, I've seen some papers that compare the belief system to that of the belief in the supernatural and religion, which you covered early on. And I know among evolutionary psychologists, there is a concept with regard to belief in the supernatural. It's called minimally counterintuitive. If it's something is too mundane, it doesn't get any attention. It has to be somewhat counterintuitive. If it's too counterintuitive, then not enough people will believe in it. And I'm wondering if that may in fact apply to conspiracy theories, in the sense that it's got to be something out of the ordinary. Otherwise, it won't get attention. I mean, just as in belief in the supernatural.
That's an interesting idea. I think I've heard of that before, but I don't know much about it, Bill. I mean, there are sort of, rules of thumb for presentations or for saying things that are memorable like that. That you don't want it to be fading into the background, but you don't want it to be so outrageous that people will dismiss it out of hand. Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I just don't know myself. I don't know any research about that particular idea. So again, if you have something that you'd recommend, please put it in the chat.
Klaus, do you have a question?
Yeah, this whole field of investigation is well out of my range of understanding, and never been, in touch with that, a completely different area. And I wondered, when you get these data where you show brain activity, what is it that you're actually measuring? Using radar or
sure,
whatever.
Sure. So what's being measured is blood flow. Basically, the idea is that if a part of your brain is working hard, it's drawing a lot more oxygen, and you sort of measure indirectly the blood flow that's coming in to support that. So the arterioles open up around the neurons when they're working hard, about 2 seconds after they start firing a lot. The way you measure that is by putting people inside a very large magnet. So you don't do this if you have any steel implants, metal implants in your body, but a very large, very strong magnet. And then you sort of spin all the hydrogen atoms up, and then you let them unspin, and you record the electromagnetic waves, radiation that comes off. And from that, you can sort of infer where the density of the hydrogen atoms was. So you can basically tell where water is. And of course, blood has a lot of water. So that's more or less the simple version of how it's done.
Enough.
I hope that was comprehensible.
Yeah. Have to think about it.
It's a very, it's a very high tech, but very crude method.
Have there been any studies of Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, where you do intuitive responses versus reasoned hard thinking responses, because we know there's physiological differences?
That's an interesting question. Danny Kahneman as far as I know, never really been fashionable among the neuroimaging crowd. I think, he won his Nobel Prize in economics. I think, even though he was trained as a statistician and psychologist, and did a lot of his work in psychology. By the way, if you're interested in a great read, The Undoing Project about Kahneman and Tversky is a nice joint biography, as well as gives some insight into their science. I'm a big fan of Kahneman and Tversky. I haven't seen any studies explicitly investigating their ideas using brain imaging, but it wouldn't surprise me. He's just not somebody who's on the radar of brain imagers a lot, I think. So I haven't seen any that I know of.
We're kind of in a catch-22, aren't we? Because it's so easy to manipulate people with what we know about our biases and the psychological power of implanted memories and framing and
I agree with you, Pamela. I'm very worried about the next 10 years. I mean, I'm hopeful that, things will look up after next Tuesday. But I'm very worried about the long term because, people who are in the business of manipulating other people's opinions are acquiring tremendous tools and power to do so. And, some of you probably know about, deep fake videos. So it's now possible. I was a little worried, I started hearing about deep fakes just after the last election. And in 2019, I heard a talk by a Google researcher that had, various celebrities singing and dancing and saying all kinds of things that they had never actually done, and absolutely convincing. And he was very proud of it. And I sort of really broke the spell in the room by asking, what are you doing to defend against this kind of thing? The whole room erupted in a nervous titter of laughter. Like, this is what everyone was thinking, but everyone is afraid to say. He gave me the official company line. Well, we have to know how to do it well in order to defeat it. Yeah, maybe. But I personally think that that's knowledge as dangerous as, do-it-yourself genetic engineering of pathogens or, nuclear, do-it-yourself nuclear weapons. So I wasn't very happy that they're doing that, and so I'm just glad that it wasn't a major factor for this election, that they weren't good enough quickly enough. I mean, there've been some deep fake videos going around, but not very many. I think in 4 years, we're going to be flooded with them.
do you think we need deep fake videos when we have like the personally targeted social and other media campaigns that political campaigns are already using, such as the article in The Guardian, Robert Mercer's War on Mainstream Media?
Yeah, I agree with you. Maybe we don't, yeah, they're already doing a lot of damage.
Right,
And,
the horse is out of the barn.
sorry?
I think the horse is out of the barn.
Yes, I agree with you. And I think that's a major issue for the next 4 years. And I would be, I'm hopeful that we'll have the bandwidth and the time to deal with it. Because if we don't deal with it, it's going to be a very big problem in 2024.
May I ask a politically incorrect question?
Sure.
Well,
Just a second, Marina.
Excuse me.
I believe Mike Archibald has got a question. Mark?
I
Mike,
I
I
do-
mean,
do too.
okay. But I guess I didn't get Mike. If you do have a question, please speak up. And then Marina, and then Tris.
So I'm just trying to understand where the logical fallacy is. If for people who could be that easily manipulated by a video, what's wrong with considering it a social Darwinism and manipulate them?
Honey, we're all easily socially manipulated. It's not a group of people who aren't vulnerable to this. Everyone is.
Some are perhaps more vulnerable than others, but yes, I agree with you, Pamela, that we can all be manipulated. I am continually surprised by my own false memories. You know, I'm pretty sure I've posted this exercise for the students. I remember posting it for the students. And then when I look, it's not there. And the students are haranguing me. And of course, I think that there's some, you know, there may be some gradations or some variability, but I think it's, you know, if the short answer, Marina, is that a lot of those people vote, and they vote for your next president. So it matters how easily they can be manipulated. Sorry, what?
I love my president. I'm glad they vote.
I see. Okay. Well, maybe they
So
will.
My only question is, how is it wrong, consider it a social Darwinism, for the people who could be manipulated to manipulate them? What's wrong with it? I don't understand.
Well, I think we generally have, you know, in most ethical traditions, we feel it's wrong to take over somebody else's life, and you know, to manipulate their minds. And of course, you could argue that that's always a part of life, that you know, when we're children, we're being manipulated by our parents, and that's not necessarily all to the bad. But it's something that, you know, if you have some hope for a liberal society where people can make up their own minds, it's something you would rather not have on a regular basis.
Right, but nobody makes up their mind in a vacuum. The minds are made up in a discussion, conversations, interactions with other people, you know, watching movies, watching commercials, you know, listening to radio. I mean, the minds are not made in a vacuum. This is just another way to manipulate the mind. I mean,
so are you saying that there's manipulation going on all the time? To some extent, I would agree with you. But what we are concerned about is how precisely, I mean, it's always going on, but we usually don't think of it as so effective and so precisely targeted. And now it seems possible to be much more effective and to be much more precise. We can sort of laugh it off if we think that, well, most of it's bouncing off anyway. I see we have several hands up, so let's move on. And Pamela, why don't you pick the next question? And I should probably wrap up in about 5 or 10 minutes.
I believe it was Chris who.
Yeah. So I have a question mark. It's interesting. This research is very black and white, if you will. As an example, I'm looking at some of the chat comments, and there's one by Richard Bennett that says, progressives and liberals are devoted to truth rather than devoted to a group or identity. Many on the right wing are interested in group cohesion and the feeling of being right. Now, that's his belief system, I'm assuming, right? And mine would be, all right, I'm a Republican, but I don't like Trump. But my thinking goes beyond that, where I'm the type of person who would like to say, in a private environment or maybe in a smaller group setting, to say, well, Richard, why do you feel that way? And I'm more open to that conversation, to understanding why his belief systems are what they are, and let him be able to have a conversation with me to understand that what my beliefs are and why I am a Republican versus a Democrat. But I don't know that these tests actually show that thinking ability that I have to be more open-minded. I might have a baseline belief system, but it doesn't mean I'm not open to change or someone else's beliefs. Would that be fair to say?
I think so.
Can I answer that question since I posed it?
Sure.
I'm just saying, I'm basing this partially on Jonathan Haidt's assessment of the moral basis of conservatives and liberals. And conservatives, I've also been involved in a study at BU in the theology department to find that people that are more religious are more cohesive as a group. And I think what I've observed about liberals and progressives is that they're quite independent, but they're not independent because they value independence in itself. They're independent because they value the effort they've put into coming up to views that are actually based in reality. And so they're a very difficult lot, and they don't put as much weight onto belonging to a group as conservatives do, and that's pretty factual.
Right, and I'm a
Jonathan
little bit.
Haidt, which I think is a good point. Yeah, go ahead, Tris.
I was just going to say I'm more of a, I guess the best way to put it, not politically, but I'm an independent thinker. So, I'm open to all ideas, if for me, there's a funny little joke. It's like everybody's everybody's perception is their reality. So, I'd like to be able to understand that.
Well, that's a whole debatable topic.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other quick comments? Difference. Thanks. I saw that Mike, or Bill put in some references. Thanks, Bill. I'll take a look at that. Any other quick comments?
I just wanted to speak against the wholesale manipulation of minds on an organized basis, just because that's, of course, one of the foundations of any totalitarian state is doing that kind of thing. And so you really don't want those tools to be readily available and used, skillfully as a matter of practice and normalized.
Right. And that's the sort of thing that big data makes possible, and of course it's developed for the all-American, pursuit of selling you things, of manipulating, but it's been taken over very effectively. It's just the kind of thing that Stalin would have wanted, but didn't know how to attain. But good old-fashioned efficient American capitalism has brought it to the totalitarians of the world.
I think you hit the nail right on the head there. We've had more than almost a century of commercialism in our brains, and boy, have we been trained.
Yeah. Well, I should wind up pretty soon because I have. It turns out that I have some more paperwork to do on the grant that I didn't realize that I did, and they're asking for it tonight. So I'd better go ahead and do that. So I will sign off in a few minutes, but thank you for your engagement and attention. And
thank you very much.
I hope we'll get to do this again. So please let me know if you'd like, a talk on something else at some point.
I have to say, Dr. Reimers sent us a list of topics he had, and my reaction was, yes, please, all of them. So I'm sure we'll have you back again.
Okay, great. Well, I'll look forward to that. Just let me know when. Take care.
And thank you, everyone, for coming this evening. It was wonderful to have you here. And there's a comment from Linda Reynolds that says, as Pat Everett's widow, I know that he would have loved this stimulating presentation and great discussion, and that is success, which makes me feel good.
And with that, I'll close the meeting, and thanks everybody for showing up. Thank you, Linda. Bye-bye.